Welcome to Dead and Roasted. What can I get you?
Alert, alert. Have you been asking for Dead and Roasted merch? Because we now have a sick new Dead and Roasted coffee mug available now at eriecast.store. And if you're an EerieCast Plus member, you can enter this new giveaway for a limited edition Dead and Roasted t-shirt. Sign up for eriecast.com/plus if you're not a member, or go to members.eriecast.com if you are. That actually works for an intro to this episode, because all of today's stories are very familiar. They're scary true stories that happened at coffee shops. Enjoy, my friends. This episode's on me. But the coffee isn't. You still gotta pay for that. Before we start, leave Tales from the Break Room a follow and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thanks. These are Tales from the Break Room. Mothman enjoys the occasional espresso. From jerseylore. I've always been a night owl, so working at a coffee shop that stayed open until midnight seemed perfect for me. I remember it was a Saturday evening in the summer to fall shift, just when the weather started to shift over from mild to unexpectedly chilly at night. It was pouring out, one of those sudden autumn or near-autumn storms where the rain comes down hard for a few minutes, then stops, and comes again even stronger. The forecast had promised thunderstorms, which always made me a little uneasy, but I wasn't about to let it ruin my night. I was working behind the counter, chatting with my coworker, Jeannie, between orders. Jeannie was just finishing her shift, wiping down tables and getting ready to head home. She joked that with the dark sky and loud thunder, it felt like we were in a cheap horror movie. I laughed at that. I only mention it now because how funny it was, how close she was. Around 9 p.m. she clocked out, leaving me alone with Jacob, the manager who mostly stayed in the back office doing inventory. We only had a handful of customers scattered at the tables. 2 local college kids studying for exams, a middle-aged man reading a newspaper, and a young woman scrolling through her phone. The storm picked up again about an hour later. Lightning streaked through the sky, flashing through the big picture windows that faced the street. Our cafe was on a corner with wide windows, so every bolt of lightning lit up the entire place like a strobe. It was mesmerizing at first, like nature was putting on a light show just for us. But the thunder that followed each flash was jarringly loud, rattling the windows. After one particularly bright flash, I noticed movement across the street. There was a small office building with a low rooftop. In that split moment, I swear I saw something perched on the ledge, like an animal, but larger than any normal bird that you'd expect to see in the city. I leaned forward, pressing my palm against the window. But the rain was coming down so hard, I couldn't be sure of anything. Another flash lit the sky, and the shape was gone. I tried to tell myself it was just a big crow, or even a trick of the light. Still, there was a pit in my stomach. I got back to work, steaming some milk for a customer's latte and forcing my mind back to practical things. I got to do some latte art, and I always loved that. Then there was the idea that we'd probably be slow the rest of the night, making my job easy. But the image of that thing I saw stayed in my mind. A little before 10:30, the cafe emptied out except for one last person. A guy named Will, one of our regulars. Will was a grad student in the physics department at the local university. He often used our late hours to study. That night, he had been hunched over his laptop, occasionally glancing up at the storm. I was wiping down the counter near the pastry case when he suddenly said to me, "Hey, did you see that?" I froze up. "See what?" "There was something out there," he said, pointing toward the window. "Looked like a weird bird or something." When he said that, I almost felt dizzy. Yeah, Actually, I thought I saw something earlier too. On the roof across the street. Will stood up and walked closer to the window. No. Just now. It looked like it was on the street lamp. I only saw it for a split second. Lightning flashed and it was gone. I joined him at the window, both of us peering out into the downpour. The sidewalk was mostly empty, just the occasional car passing by. There was no sign of anything else, though. Even so, Will's face had gone pale. I could tell he wasn't joking about this. Probably a big hawk or an owl, I suggested, trying to reassure him, but I think he could tell I was lying from my tone. He packed up his laptop and said a quick goodnight, and left. As soon as he stepped outside, the door slammed shut behind him in a gust of wind and thunder. I watched him hurry away under his jacket. Now I was completely alone up front. Jacob was still in the office, and for some reason, it felt way too quiet in that cafe. I put on some background music, something low and soothing to help me relax. I tried to keep myself busy too. We were low on cups and lids, so I stocked up. Every so often, I couldn't help but look out the window, just to check. The storm had gotten so intense it was practically horizontal rainfall. The lightning was becoming less frequent, but when it did flash, it lit up the entire block. Around 11 p.m., Jacob came out to help me with some final tasks. I asked if he would step up front with me, because I was feeling a bit jumpy. I even confessed I had seen a weird shape earlier through the window. He chuckled, muttering something about how the storm can make you feel scared. But he agreed to hang around until closing, so we could leave together. Frankly, I was relieved, though with the scared of storms remark, I wanted to tell him I wasn't a kid, but I kept that part to myself. Time passed by slowly. Eventually, the thunder receded into a dull rumble. The lightning moved further away. By 11:30, we were certain no more customers would be coming in, so we started our pre-closing rituals, cleaning the espresso machine, counting the register, and putting away pastries. We shut off our neon open sign, leaving only the overhead lights that were kind of dim. And that is when the power began to flicker. The lights dimmed, came back, then went out entirely for a second or two. I swear my heart climbed up my throat every time it went dark. Then, with a loud hum, the electricity came back on altogether. Everything seemed normal again, except for my now shallow, intense breathing. Jacob went to check the breaker. I found myself alone at the front counter again, facing those windows. Despite the overhead lights, the street outside was still black and rainy. I looked up at the building across the street again, the one with the low rooftop. The only source of light there was a nearby street lamp, but it didn't light up much. I almost didn't notice anything until lightning flashed again, so bright it might have been right overhead. That's when I saw it, a massive silhouette perched on the ledge. This time, there was no mistaking it. The shape was vaguely human, but with large folded wings curving behind it. The flash lasted maybe a second, but it felt like time slowed down, long enough for me to see two faint glowing spots where eyes might be. When the lightning died, plunging everything back into darkness, I stumbled backward, heart pounding so loudly it vibrated my ears. Jacob must have heard me gasp, because he dashed into the front from the back. "What happened?" he asked. I pointed at the window. "There's something on the roof over there, Jacob. I swear I saw something. Something not normal." He frowned but edged toward the window carefully. "I don't see anything," he said. "It's dark. Are you sure you didn't mistake a statue or some weird construction equipment?" I know what I saw. The thing had wings, like a giant bat. The words sounded insane coming out of my mouth, but I was certain. My arms were still covered in goosebumps. Jacob grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight, shining it through the window. Of course, all we saw was a reflection of ourselves against the glass. The wind was beating against the door and rattling it. For a moment, we both stood there, not sure what to do next. The thunder banged again, closer now, like the storm was circling back on us. "I need to lock things up," I told Jacob. "We should get out of here." He nodded. We finished shutting things down, turned off the lights, and made sure everything was secure. I grabbed my coat. My plan, personally, was to make a mad dash for my car. As we stepped outside, the rain pelted us so hard it hurt, and the wind was so bad it made my umbrella useless. I gave up on that almost immediately, letting the gust flip it inside out. Jacob had the same idea, I guess, because he was already halfway to his car, yelling something that I couldn't hear because of the storm. Suddenly, there was a bright, jagged fork of lightning splitting the sky above us. For an instant, it lit up not just the street, but the rooftop and the clouds, too. I glanced up, and I saw that same creature rising from the building, spreading huge bat-like wings and launching into the air. Its eyes reflected the lightning in a way that made them look bright red. I froze, like some sort of prey animal. My mouth was wide open, and I watched it ascend, praying it wasn't going to swoop down on me. It happened in less than a second, but an image like that gets seared into your mind, like a mental tattoo. I then let out a choked scream, scrabbling to unlock my door. My hands were so slippery with rain that I had a lot of trouble, but eventually I got in, slamming the door shut and locking it. Jacob already had his engine started. I saw his headlights cut through the dark, and I peeled out of the spot behind him, not caring about any puddles or potholes. The next morning I called Jeannie, asking if she had noticed anything weird that night, but she'd left too early. She listened to my rambling story, half in disbelief, and also concerned. She said maybe it was some sort of large bird that got caught in the storm. I wished she was right, but that was no bird. Birds aren't shaped like people with bat wings that big. And I don't think a bird would give me that sense of terror, that primal feeling you get that something is very wrong and possibly very dangerous. Will, the grad student regular, came in a few days later, wanting to ask about the odd shape he'd seen. He looked relieved and a little scared when I told him I'd seen it too. He asked if I was sure of what I saw, and I admitted that I was. I still work at that cafe. I like to make sure, though, that my shifts end earlier these days. There haven't been any more sightings like that, at least not that I've heard. But I do find myself on occasion checking that rooftop through the window, afraid I might see it again. And when the rain does come down when I'm on the clock, I guess some sort of PTSD happens, because it makes my stomach cramp up, and I get real nervous. Whether it's Mothman or something else, I just hope I never see it again. Starbucks Near the Overpass. From Taunted 2. I manage a certain Starbucks off the interstate in Massachusetts. I won't say exactly where, but people do often joke that it's in the middle of nowhere, because aside from our little cluster of shops and gas stations, there isn't much else around. However, we do stay busy enough thanks to travelers and truckers and local folks on their way to or from work. The place itself isn't all that remarkable. Your standard green awnings, drive-through window, bright interior with tables for college students to spread out their laptops. Same as any Starbucks, really. But there is an odd detail. We're right next to a crumbling old overpass that used to be part of a rail line decades ago. These days, it's just a dingy bridge spanning a dried-up creek and an abandoned side road. People say it's haunted. There's a local story about a young woman who vanished near that spot in the 1960s. And ever since, folks claim to see a figure under that bridge late at night. Sometimes wearing a white dress, sometimes holding a lantern. Sounds like any run-of-the-mill ghost story, right? I used to roll my eyes whenever customers brought it up. But let me tell you, I don't roll them anymore. It all started a few months ago. I was used to working the early shifts, getting there at 4:30 a.m. to prep for opening. I preferred the mornings, but as manager I have to cover all kinds of hours if need be. One night I got stuck closing, as our closer called out sick last minute. That meant I'd be at the shop until around 11 p.m., doing the final count and locking up. Not my favorite schedule, but it was my responsibility. At around 9 p.m., we'd shut off the dining room lights, leaving just enough illumination for cleaning. Only the drive-thru was still open for another hour. It was a slow night with only a couple of cars coming through in that last stretch. My shift supervisor, Kendra, was reorganizing some boxes in the back. I was out front wiping counters and double-checking inventory. As I passed the windows facing the overpass, I noticed something. The streetlight near the bridge was dim at best, and with the trees casting shadows, it was hard to see what was out there. Still, for a split second, I spotted a person walking beneath the bridge. At first, I figured it was a homeless person looking for shelter from the cold. We do see vagrants from time to time, though usually closer to the highway on-ramps. Didn't think much of it. I finished cleaning and went to throw out the garbage. Our dumpster is around the side of the building, which offers a partial view of that overpass. By then, it was almost 10 p.m. The air was damp and the night was quiet, except for the low hum of passing cars on the interstate. As I closed the dumpster lid, I heard a noise that sounded like shuffling or scraping metal. I turned toward the overpass. I couldn't see anyone, but I got this uneasy feeling, like someone was watching me. It was that prickly sensation that starts at the back of your neck. I hurried on back inside, locking the side door behind me. Kendra noticed I looked spooked. She asked if I was okay, and I brushed it off, just telling her, "Yeah, I thought I heard something weird near the bridge." We both laughed it away, talking about how people have claimed to see the overpass ghost. We even shared stories customers had told us. How a woman in a white dress supposedly stands by the concrete pillars, or how some nights you see her lantern swinging under the bridge. We joked that maybe we would get an extra customer if the ghost got thirsty for a latte. We finished closing up and parted ways around 10:45 p.m. Kendra got into her car and drove away. I stayed behind a bit to handle the deposit. Around 11 p.m., I stepped out to head to my own car. It was then that I noticed a figure standing in the gloom, just beyond the light from our parking lot. Definitely tall, hunched forward slightly, like they were trying to keep a low profile. I paused. "Hello?" I called out. It was more to reassure myself than anything else. The figure shifted a step closer into the faint light, revealing a stooped man with ragged clothes and what looked to be a dirty hood pulled over his head. I relaxed a little. It didn't look like a ghost, just a rough vagrant. But something about him gave me chills. Maybe it was the way his eyes looked, how unnaturally still he stood. "Do you need help?" I asked, trying to sound polite and calm. He didn't answer, didn't move. I felt uncomfortable. Normally, I would offer a cup of water or ask if they needed directions, but his silence threw me off. I decided to walk toward my car, which was unfortunately parked closer to him than I liked. My footsteps sounded too loud on the pavement. As I got to my door, I glanced back, and the man was gone, without a trace. There was nowhere obvious to hide unless he had darted behind the building. That moment, I remembered the stories of the haunted overpass, the missing girl, all that local lore. But that was just a man, right? Still, I felt very creeped out about this. I drove home trying to shake the feeling. The next morning, I confided in Kendra and a couple of other baristas about the strange encounter. They teased me, but also shared their stories. One of them had found weird footprints by the dumpster and heard a faint moaning noise some nights. Another had glimpsed someone under the bridge when the lights flickered, and only when they flickered. Nothing super conclusive or direct. Eventually, it became our resident ghost, though I still wasn't sure if it wasn't just some weird person hanging about. A few weeks later, I had another closing shift. This time, I kept my eyes peeled whenever I walked by the windows. Sure enough, around 9:30, I spotted movement by the overpass. I turned the music down to listen. Through the glass, I heard a dragging sound, like someone hauling something heavy along concrete. Was it the same guy? I decided to lock up earlier. Kendra was there once again, so I quietly told her to finish up and not linger. We locked up the doors and switched off most of the lights by 10:15. I made sure the drive-through window was secured, then stepped outside to verify the main entrance was locked. And then I heard footsteps behind me. Slow, deliberate footsteps on wet pavement. I spun around, expecting that man. Instead, a silhouette stood near the overpass, partially obscured by the line of shrubs. The figure's posture was rigid, arms at their sides, head tilted in my direction. It felt like they were staring at me, even though I couldn't be sure. It was too dark. My pulse pounded in my ears as I realized this person wore something white or pale. It shone faintly under the distant streetlight. I rushed back inside using my keys and locked the door. Thought my heart was going to explode. Kendra asked what was wrong, and I just said, "There's someone under the bridge. They're just standing there." She came over to the window, but by then the figure was gone. Not a trace. We decided to call it a night, whether we were actually done or not. We both bolted to our cars and drove away. Later, we told the rest of the staff, some of them insisting it was a wandering homeless person, others thinking I'd seen the girl in white. But nobody could explain the unsettling stillness or why they vanished so suddenly. After that, I requested not to close alone. Even our district manager agreed to adjust the schedule, since we have a history of vagrants near the property. Since then, any shift of mine that goes past sundown, I make sure I'm not the last one leaving. My Stalker Turned Attacker. From Anonymous. I started to work at a place called Good Vibes about 3 summers ago. It's this small cafe in a quiet Canadian region that doesn't usually see much drama. We're tucked between a pharmacy and a local artisan shop, and a strip mall that's seen better days. The sign out front has a giant peace symbol with cartoonish letters spelling Good Vibes, so most folks assume we're laid back, a friendly spot. Honestly, that's how we tried to run things. People would drop by for organic tea blends and homemade pastries, and big mugs of freshly roasted coffee. We knew a lot of our regulars by name. My boss, Jade, was the real heart of the place. She believed in local sourcing, fair wages, and created a chill environment. She hired me because I was good at chatting with customers, always remembered someone's usual, and could do latte art that made kids giggle. Plus, I'd grown up around here, so I wasn't going anywhere. Most of the other employees, though, came and went, but I planned to stay longer. A few months in, I noticed one particular customer who stood out. His name was Lawrence. Lawrence was older, maybe in his early 60s. He had this off-kilter manner that drew my attention. He'd hover by the door before stepping inside, like he was trying to decide if entering was safe. But once he did come in, he'd zoom right up to the counter, stare at the menu board without blinking, and quietly place an order. Usually it was a small black coffee. Straight up. No cream and no sugar. At first, I simply thought he was shy. Lots of people who struggle with anxiety find coffee shops a challenge. So I tried to be gentle, offering a smile and not pushing small talk unless he initiated. He'd return that smile most days, kind of an anxious twitch at the corners of his mouth. He never chatted much, except to mention the weather or to ask if the Wi-Fi was working. I soon discovered from Jade that he sometimes rambled about conspiracies or got paranoid about customers watching him. But I never personally saw any of that. He always approached me calmly. Around the end of my first year, something in Lawrence changed. He began to come in more often, sometimes even 3 times a day. He'd enter good vibes with a jittery energy, scanning the room before placing an order. Then he started to wait near the counter while I brewed his coffee, ignoring any vacant tables. I'd ask if he wanted to sit, but he'd mutter, "No, I'm okay." I'd hand him his coffee and he'd linger a bit too long, trying to catch my eye. It was like he had something on his mind. Soon he went from ordering coffee to asking about my schedule. "When do you open tomorrow?" Or, "What time do you usually leave?" Innocent enough questions, I guess. Maybe he was just particular about timing. But it became repetitive, and there was a tension in his voice, like he was storing that information away. I told Jade, who said I could politely avoid sharing too many details. Still, we didn't want to treat him poorly or call him out. Lawrence had never been rude or aggressive, just intense. Then the actual stalking began. I noticed he'd be outside in the parking lot more often, pacing near the big windows. Once I locked the cafe at closing only to spot him behind the dumpster, smoking a cigarette and staring in my direction. The next morning I mentioned it to Jade again, but she figured he was loitering. "This area isn't too busy at night," she said with a shrug. Maybe he had nowhere else to go. But it escalated. One morning I arrived bright and early, 6:30 a.m. I found Lawrence already waiting by the door. He had these circles under his eyes, as if he'd been up all night. He greeted me with this wild and urgent smile. "Good morning," he said, voice unsteady. "You're here on time. I checked the bus schedule for you." I forced a chuckle, told him we wouldn't open for another half hour, and tried to unlock the doors without letting him in. The whole time he stood inches from me, breathing heavily. Eventually he backed off, pacing until we opened. My coworker Bree saw the look on my face and asked if I was okay. When I explained how Lawrence had been tracking my arrivals, she looked upset. "I heard from a customer that he's unwell. They say he's a schizophrenic and may not be on medication." That revelation made me feel torn. On one hand, I empathized. Mental illness can be debilitating. I've seen it in my own family. On the other hand, I was terrified. Something about his behavior was heading towards obsession, and I didn't know how to handle that safely. A week later, I got off my bus in the early evening, and as I did, I suddenly felt someone's gaze on me. Sure enough, there was Lawrence on the corner, watching from behind a street sign. He followed me halfway to my apartment building, never coming too close, but certainly following me. He was close enough that I could hear his footsteps echo mine. I sped up, a feeling of dread rising in my throat. I had my keys clenched in my hand, ready to either unlock my door or use it for defense. When I finally reached my complex, I didn't see him anymore. The next day, I told Jade I felt unsafe around him. She offered to let me switch hours, so I wouldn't have to close alone, or start later so I wouldn't arrive when it was dark. For a while, that seemed to help. Lawrence came in less frequently, or maybe I just missed him with my new schedule. Then one Friday afternoon, I ended up alone on shift because Bree was sick and Jade had a meeting across town. Bad timing. The cafe was nearly empty. Just a couple of folks still lingered. The clock read 3:15 p.m. when Lawrence stepped inside. He looked disheveled, jacket on backwards, or maybe he wore it incorrectly in a rush. His hair was wild and eyes were red-rimmed. His face looked rough. I tried to stay calm. "Hi, Lawrence, what can I get you?" I asked. He stood at the counter, no expression, then started to mutter. "They're all lying. I need you to tell me the truth. Are you recording me?" I blinked. "What?" He raised a shaky finger in my face, pointing at my hair. "Your earpiece. You are an informant." I wasn't wearing an earpiece, just a simple hair tie. Then something snapped in his eyes. He then lunged forward, slamming his hand on the counter. Some folks by the window gasped. I backed up a step, fear crawling up my spine. "Lawrence," I said softly, "maybe you should have a seat. I can bring you some water." He shook his head violently, eyes brimming with tears. "No more lies!" Then he turned and ran out. My knees felt weak. The couple that was by the window hurried over to me to check on me. I was just shaken. So I told them it was fine, that he was having a rough day. Maybe I was making excuses for him, but I didn't want to stir any panic. I hoped that would be the end of it. But then closing time came around. Bree came in for the later part of the shift, but left at 7 p.m. for a doctor's appointment. By 7:30, I was alone again, finishing up tasks for the night. It was dark outside, windy too. I started to wipe some tables, keeping my eye on the door. I couldn't relax. I just kept hoping no one would come in, especially Lawrence. The attack came out of nowhere. One moment I was flipping chairs onto tables. The next I heard heavy footsteps. I turned and Lawrence was right there in the shop, like he had just materialized from nowhere. I had never heard the door open. He looked so full of hatred, and his face was covered in tears. He was panting, shoulders squared up. He was holding a box cutter in his left hand. I froze. "Lawrence, put that down," I whispered, trying to back away. He advanced, cornering me against the counter. "You've been lying," he hissed. "Telling them where to go. You want them to lock me up?" I trembled, shaking my head. "I'm not telling anyone anything. I don't know what you're talking about. I just work here." He quickly looked around, like he was searching for cameras or microphones or something else. Then, with a sudden and desperate cry, he swiped the box cutter at me. I jumped back and screamed as it grazed my arm, felt a sharp sting in my skin. I then tried to bolt around him, but he grabbed me by the wrist. In that split second, I realized he might kill me. He seemed lost in his own made-up world, as if I was some sort of enemy. I wrenched my arm free and pushed him back as hard as I could. He staggered, crashing into a table. I seized the opportunity and ran for the door. There was another slash at my side. I felt fire on my ribs, but adrenaline drove me forward. I stumbled out into the parking lot, screaming for help. A passing driver must have seen us through the windows. The police arrived quickly. Lawrence was still behind me, breathing heavily, but when the sirens flared, he crumpled to his knees. He clutched his head, crying, the box cutter falling from his hand. 2 officers pinned him down. An ambulance took me to the hospital. I had 2 deep lacerations, but thankfully, no organ damage. I heard later that Lawrence was charged, evaluated, and sent for psychiatric care. Honestly, I felt an odd mixture of pity and terror when I learned that. To this day, I have nightmares where I see his eyes and feel his grip on my wrist, and my mind forces me to relive, to re-feel the slashing of that box cutter on my skin. Well, I still work at Good Vibes, but I let them know if I ever end up working alone or get scheduled to work alone, I'm not going to be there. If I have one other person on the shift and they leave for whatever reason, I'm gone too. Luckily, Jade has installed some extra security measures. New locks, better alarms. I just wish I could fully move on, but I don't think people were made to move on from things like this. At least, it's over. The Event Horizon. From Richie Finch. I always start my shift at 5 in the evening, so I have this little ritual of dropping by my favorite coffee spot about half an hour beforehand. It's not a big, famous chain. It's a cozy, independent cafe. The sign outside is a bit faded, and the hours scribbled in the window glass can sometimes be hard to read. But I love the vibe inside. It's become part of my daily routine. Head in, nod to the baristas, order my cafe mocha with an extra shot of espresso, and take a quick breather before my job starts. Being a security guard at a local mall can get tense sometimes, and that coffee is my evening lifeline. On this particular night, I'd arrived a bit earlier than usual, which meant fewer customers. Only one person stood in line ahead of me. The cafe always has these mellow tunes playing, and the overhead lights are warm and inviting. I love the smell of roasted beans and sweet pastries. Puts me in a good mood right away. Everything felt normal that day, until I noticed the staff behind the counter whispering urgently to one another. That was unusual for such a laid-back place. When they saw me, they waved me over, like they were relieved that I'd shown up. "Hey, Graham," said Mariana, the main barista. She greeted me by name, like she always did, but her voice was a bit shaky this time. Her eyes flicked toward the back hallway. Something weird is going on in the supply room. Could you maybe help us check it out? I frowned, looking from one barista to the next. Rico, who usually cracks jokes about my uniform, looked downright pale. A third staff member I barely recognized, probably knew, kept her gaze on the floor. None of them seemed eager to talk. My immediate thought was that maybe there was a break-in or a rodent problem. But if it were just a rodent, why would they be so spooked? Sure, I said, slowly, glancing at my watch. I've got a few minutes. But what's going on exactly? Mariana looked embarrassed, as though she didn't really want to explain. Finally, she shook her head. It's just easier to show you. She gestured toward the back. I noticed she didn't step away from the counter until she realized I was going to walk back with her. We made our way down a narrow hallway, lined with various framed photos of coffee-related art. The usual cheesy cafe stuff, you know. I'd passed by these 100 times on my way to the restroom in the past. The air felt oddly thick or heavier now, though. Maybe that was just the tension emanating from Mariana and Rico. They stopped about 10 feet from a closed door, labeled Supply Room. Are you sure I should be back here? I mean, I'm not employed here. Go ahead, Mariana whispered, arms folded tight over her chest. I want you to just try to approach that door. I shot her a confused look, then laughed. Approach the door? That's it? Why? Rico cleared his throat. Look, it sounds insane, but every time one of us has tried to open it tonight, anyone, even the new hire, we get this wave of fear. It's like you can't breathe, like your heart's gonna explode. Even I had tears running down my face. I physically cannot touch that doorknob, even if I tried. I stared at him, convinced they were setting me up for some elaborate prank. It was that kind of story. A gag to scare the new guy, except I wasn't new. I'd been coming here for nearly a year. You're messing with me, I said, half smiling. Rico looked away, then nodded at Mariana. She stepped forward, took a shaky breath, and started to walk toward the door. She managed maybe 3 steps before she froze in place. I saw her face contort, like she had just seen the most horrific traffic accident. Then her eyes became all teary, and she let out a gasp, stumbling backward. Either she was the most talented, undiscovered actress ever, or she wasn't acting. My chest tightened up, just watching her like that. She backed up so fast, she nearly tripped over herself, then crashed right into Rico. She was shaking like a leaf. There was no question about it. Either she deserved an Oscar, or she was genuinely afraid. She gulped down air and shook her head over and over, refusing to even look at the door again. See what I mean? Rico said, eyes wide. We're not fooling you. It's not fake. We can't get near it. We've tried all evening. We haven't been able to restock cups or sugar or anything. Customers keep asking why we look so, I don't know, anxious. I felt a chill spread through my limbs. Despite my skepticism, their reaction was real enough to really freak me out. Maybe it was a gas leak. Maybe some kind of chemical in that room was causing a panic response. But that didn't make sense either. How would it wear off the moment you walked away? So, you want me to open the door? Yeah, Mariana breathed. I mean, you are a security guard, right? You can handle tense situations. I nodded slowly, swallowing the lump in my throat. I was really just a mall cop, and hearing that gave me a bit of a big head. I'll give it a shot. Look, guys, I looked at them. If this is a prank, I'm coming back for a free mocha every day for a month. Mariana didn't even crack a smile. She just stepped aside, letting me pass. I took a step, then another, not feeling anything unusual yet. The hallway light buzzed above. My footsteps sounded uncomfortably loud on the floor. The closer I got to that door, the more something like static crawled under my skin. But maybe I was paranoid. Around 3 feet away, that static grew. My palms started to sweat. By the time I was inches away from the doorknob, a sudden and overwhelming terror crashed into me. It felt like stepping off a curb into an oncoming truck. Sheer animalistic panic. My breath caught in my throat, adrenaline flooding my veins, but I couldn't make myself move forward anymore. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes from the force of that dread. Come on, Graham. It's just a door, I whispered to myself. My entire body was trembling by then. I reached out an arm, hand shaking so bad I couldn't keep it steady. The doorknob, brass and scuffed with age, seemed a million miles away, even though it was right there in front of me. I tried to force my hand closer, but my knees began to buckle. A jolt of fear pinned me in place, like some invisible barrier trying to push me back. I gasped then, staggering backward, almost losing my footing. I'd never experienced anything like that. Even I began to feel tears come from my eyes. It was raw terror, like every phobia I'd ever had, condensed into one horrifying instant. Within seconds, I retreated halfway down the hallway, panting. Mariana and Rico caught me, each grabbing an arm. For a moment, none of us spoke. My breathing was ragged. Finally, Mariana murmured, "Now you see why we asked. We've tried to call the owner, but she's out of town right now, and none of us can get near that door. We don't know what to do. We have no idea why this is happening." I wanted to reply, but I couldn't yet. It took a good 30 seconds more of shaky silence before I could find words. This is impossible. We should call the fire department or the police or something. Maybe there's a chemical leak, an electromagnetic field messing with our brains." Rico's eyes flicked to the door, then back to me. "We already tried calling a non-emergency line. The cops thought we were pulling a prank. They said they'd send someone if it was a real threat, but as soon as we described the situation, they pretty much brushed us off." "So what are you guys gonna do? You can't just close the cafe, can you?" Mariana exchanged a look with Rico and shrugged. "We might have to. Customers are going to notice we're not restocking, and we can't have employees fainting in the back corridor." Feeling a swirl of dread and confusion, I wiped my face, trying to hide the fact that I was still trembling. Let me try one more time," I said, though the notion sent a surge of fresh anxiety through my chest. "I'll hold my breath, just run up and try to yank it open." "That's how I got that bruise," Rico admitted, rolling up his sleeve to show a dark mark on his forearm. "I tried the whole rush tactic earlier. It didn't end well." I felt my jaw clench. I was still in disbelief that this was even happening. But the raw memory of that terror was as painful as a childhood scar. "I just don't get it," I mumbled. "A door can't do that. It's like the room is radiating fear." "That's exactly it," Mariana replied. "Whatever's in there, or whatever's around the door, it's not normal." Eventually, I gave it one last shot. I took a few steps forward, heart going like a million miles a minute. This time, the fear hit me so violently, I couldn't even raise my arm. My legs threatened to collapse. It felt like my mind was screaming at me to retreat. I had no choice but to stumble back, tears flooding my eyes again. No matter what I did, I could not force myself to touch that doorknob. It was like some primal terror took over my body. Mariana nodded, as if accepting our defeat. "I don't know how we can keep running business like this. But thank you for trying, Graham." I cleared my throat and glanced at my watch. I had to get to my shift soon, and my head was still spinning. "I'm so sorry I couldn't do more. Are you guys going to be okay?" "We'll figure something out," Rico said, though he didn't sound too sure to me. I bid them good night, leaving right there and then. The adrenaline was still surging in my veins. I needed fresh air more than I needed caffeine. As I stepped outside, the breeze felt nice and cool, like a wake-up call. I walked quickly to my car, glancing back at the cafe's warmly lit windows. No sign of anything supernatural from the outside. But I knew what I'd felt. That sense of absolute dread was no trick of my mind. It was real and more intense than I'd ever felt. I kept thinking about it all night at work. I've dealt with alarm calls and locked doors countless times, but never once have I been unable to turn a doorknob out of sheer terror. I even Googled paralyzing fear near door on my phone during a break, but that just led me to random ghost stories and panic attack forums. None of it made sense to me. The next day I had an early errand before my shift, so I swung by the cafe around noon, wanting to talk to Mariana or Rico or both. Maybe they'd found a solution, but I got there to find a sign on the door. Closed. Sorry for the inconvenience. I peered through the front windows. The lights were off, and the chairs were stacked up on the tables. There was no one inside. My stomach turned. They never closed midday, especially not on a weekday. That sign looked hastily taped up, too. Did something worse happen overnight? Did they find out what was in that supply room? Or did the staff just bail rather than deal with it? I tried calling the cafe's phone number, but it went straight to voicemail. I left a message, not really expecting a reply. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling. Something had driven them to shut down, maybe for good. Maybe they could call a specialist or have the door forcibly removed. The possibilities churned in my mind. As the days passed, my favorite cafe remained closed, and there was no explanation. Later on, one day, I checked the cafe again. There was a new sheet of paper at the window. It read, "Under renovation." But there were no trucks or workers there. The place just sat there quietly. I haven't seen Mariana or Rico again. If that door, and whatever it was hiding, drove them away for good, I guess I'll never know. I missed that place. The Note from Carly A.J. I've been the opener for our coffee shop for almost 2 years now. It's always been a very straightforward routine. I'll show up at 5:45 a.m., kill the alarm, turn on the lights, and start brewing the first batch of drip coffee, greeting the early birds. Nothing about it was ever mysterious or remarkable. That is, until a few weeks back, when I started to find a single folded-up note on the front counter almost every morning. At first, I assumed it was something left over from a night shift coworker. Maybe a heads up about low inventory or a broken machine. But it wasn't. The note simply read in neat cursive, "Don't look outside at 2:13 p.m. No explanation, no signature. I remember standing there with a slip of paper in my hand, eyebrow raised, trying to figure out which of my coworkers had this kind of sense of humor. When I asked around, none of them knew a thing about it. But that's what they claimed. By lunchtime, I'd tossed the note in the trash. The next day, there was another, identical handwriting and the same message. "Don't look outside at 2:13 p.m. That time, I stuck it on the bulletin board in the break room, as a joke, or counter-joke. Everyone passing through commented on it, and we had a good laugh. What's supposed to happen at 2:13? The apocalypse? One coworker teased that it was just some silly marketing stunt, like we'd do a happy hour special at 2:13 or something. We forgot about it in the rush of midday orders. But the day after that, it showed up again. Now I was starting to get creeped out. We lock the cafe up every night, and the only people with access are staff. So how'd this note keep reappearing? I double-checked that each person on the schedule was accounted for, but nobody owned up to sneaking in. One afternoon, I even brought it up to my manager, who shrugged and told me, "If it's not hurting business, just let it go." The message was weird, sure, but I decided there were better things to worry about. Problem was, no matter how many times I threw it away or pinned it up, I'd come in the next morning to the same perfect note, neatly folded, lying on the counter. I'd ask the closing shift baristas if they left any notes for me, and they would say no. So it had to have happened after close, but before I arrived. The strangest part was that nothing else in the shop seemed disturbed. No broken windows, no tampered locks. About a week later, I made the mistake of ignoring the note entirely. I told myself it was probably just some bored individual sneaking in with a key we'd lost track of. The day in question, the day everything changed, was a Monday. As usual, we opened at 6 a.m. We had a steady stream of regulars all morning. Around 2 p.m., the rush had eased, and I was tidying up the condiment bar, chatting with a coworker about weekend plans. That's when I remembered the note. Glancing at my phone, I saw it was 2:11 p.m. I almost laughed. "Hey, it's that magic time," I joked to my coworker. He rolled his eyes after he got it, and said maybe we should pull the blinds, just in case. I teased back, "Why, some mythical monster gonna appear?" My phone changed to 2:12 then. I turned to look out the front window. Outside, everything looked normal. Parked cars, people driving by. A few moments later, my phone ticked over to 2:13. Now, I'm not even sure I could describe what I saw. At first, it was just a figure, like someone standing across the street, partially obscured by the trunk of a tree. I assumed it was a pedestrian or neighbor, but something about the way they stood made my stomach sink. Rigid, head turned toward our cafe window, face hidden by the tree's shadow. They weren't moving, but I had the distinct feeling they were staring right at me. I tried to breathe normally, telling myself the timing was a coincidence, and thus was making me paranoid. Then the figure stepped out into the open. I expected to see a normal human shape. Instead, I noticed that their limbs seemed very long, and their posture was unnaturally contorted. At that moment, it was like everything around me blurred. Everything except that figure, which was terrifyingly focused. I couldn't blink, couldn't tear my eyes away. I heard my coworker's voice sounding distant, but he said, over and over, "Are you okay? Are you okay?" But I couldn't answer. I watched as the figure raised a hand, as if to greet me. A wave that lacked any warmth and felt more like a threat. That's when my coworker tugged on my arm hard enough to break this spell. I stumbled back. By the time I blinked and looked again, it was gone. Vanished as if it had never been there. But I felt absolutely shaken. My hands were quivering. I couldn't even hold a coffee cup. My coworker stood there, demanding to know what happened, but I couldn't yet put it into words. It wasn't just some weird stranger. Something about that figure felt more than normal. Right after that event, as if the mission was complete by whatever power was at work, the notes stopped coming. It was like something out there wanted to scare the bejesus out of me. I don't look out the windows at work anymore unless I absolutely have to. And when I do, I check the time. I don't know what that was. Some sort of prank by some people I don't know. Sure, that's what I'll choose to believe. But that doesn't explain the dread and the terror. Everything about it was so very odd. Oh, don't be scared now to come on back for your daily white chocolate mocha or your regular coffee with 2 creams and 2 sugars, whichever bean juice concoction gets your day going. Coffee shops can be home to some creepy things, but in the end, caffeine is worth fighting for. Thanks for listening to another episode of Tales from the Break Room. I'm Darkness Prevails, and you can find me on X at Dark Prevails. If you're a superfan, you can support the show by buying our new Dead and Roasted coffee mug, or becoming a member at eriecast.com/plus for extra content and more goodies. You'll also be able to enter our new giveaway for a limited edition Dead and Roasted t-shirt. Oh, and send us your scary work stories at eriecast.com/submit. Finally, help us become the world's go-to podcast for scary stories by leaving us a follow and review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Thank you. Now I've got to clock out. But don't worry, I'll be clocking back in real soon.